Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. We have really two incredible speakers today. My terrific boss, Chris Costa, the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum. He'll be leading the conversation, and we are so lucky to have one of our top Spy Museum board members here, the Honorable Mary Beth Long. She is the former Assistant Secretary of Defense and was the first female chair of NATO's high-level group. She served as the Senior Defense Representative to the Deputies Committee at the National Security Council and held a number of other senior positions, including Principal Deputy Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Africa, the Western Hemisphere, and Asia, and Southeast Asia. And I hope I didn't drop a line there. There is much more that she did, and it's incredibly impressive. Chris and Mary Beth are each going to present about the topics that are catching their attention right now, and they might also share things that they are reading. Now, before I turn this over to Chris, I have to thank so much our incredible sponsors today, Mission Solutions Group. They have been so supportive. They have offered us ongoing support, and we want to especially thank their leadership. Damon Walsh and Kevin Ferraro really have cared so deeply about our educational mission, and we're excited because Damon Walsh is one of our newest board members. So thank you, Mission Solutions Group. Thank you, Chris and Mary Beth. I am going to disappear, and I'm going to let Chris take it away.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much, Amanda, for the great introduction, as always. I want to reiterate my thanks, my personal thanks to Mission Solutions Group, and certainly Damon Walsh and Kevin Ferraro. We're looking forward to connecting with the team a little bit later. So before I dive in, I also want to thank Mary Beth in advance, the Honorable Mary Beth Long, a significant and important member of our board, and as you'll see, very, very experienced and connected to several of the issues that I'll talk about today, certainly from a knowledge standpoint. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in and tell our audience the first article that got my attention since last Spy Chat. Ex-CIA director, former director of CIA, John Brennan, was questioned for 8 hours at CIA in August. He was questioned as a result of U.S. Attorney John Durham's probe from the Department of Justice. And he is being questioned. He's not the subject of the investigation, but there's an inquiry that is ongoing on how the intelligence community broadly handled investigating Russian interference on the heels of the 2016 election. The questioning, by all accounts, is wide-ranging, and at the same time, it will assess, apparently, even analytical tradecraft. So this is interesting. It's a story everyone should pay attention to. There's some discussion that there's going to be an interim report released in advance of the November election. So I think that is an important story for the intelligence community here in the United States. But not just United States stories do we track here. I want to talk about Alexei Navalny, and I think I got that name right. Alexei, the opponent of Putin, was recently poisoned in Siberia. I think many of you are tracking that particular case. He was put in an induced coma by medical authorities in Germany. It appears that he has been the victim of poisoning. Now, we've talked about this repeatedly on Spy Chats. We tell the stories of assassination in the Soviet Union's history, everything from an ice axe to poisonings, which is very popular. Novichok, it seems, was used, and that's a poison that we know that the Russian intelligence services have already used against dissidents. Skripal was poisoned in the UK, a former intelligence officer that was living in the United Kingdom. So I think we understand that story, and it's just fascinating as it continues to evolve. The key point is it looks like Russia is dusting off one of their playbooks. So to transition a little bit to a counterintelligence story that really got my attention, and it's alarming in terms of the betrayal from a United States standpoint, but it seems that a special forces officer, a Green Beret in the 1990s, circa 1996, was potentially developed and then recruited by Russian intelligence services. It seems that at some point in time, if you look at the indictment, this Green Beret was recruited by Russian military intelligence. Now, he left the Army in 2005. Some interesting circumstances that I'm not sure are entirely clear for me, some security violation when he was operating as a special forces officer in Azerbaijan and the state of Georgia, the country, nation state of Georgia, I should say. What's interesting about this case is it looks like it was an ideological recruitment. So that really got my attention, not only the years of betrayal, because the contact that he had with the Russians continued to at least 2011. So he was charged with espionage-related offenses. So it's more of the same. Classic espionage continues to play out, and this is a great example of a counterintelligence investigation and subsequent prosecution. The next case is actually fresh, or the next article is fresh in terms of even an op-ed that's related that hit the New York Times this morning from former head of the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats. So he led the intelligence community. Dan Coats has been outspoken recently in talking about the importance of in-person briefings to Congress on election interference. And today, just to reinforce his point, he published an op-ed that I just saw moments before that we went live today. And the op-ed, in essence, is Coats advocating for a commission, a nonpartisan commission, to ensure that the American public is confident on the legitimacy of our election and our electoral process. And this is the backdrop for all of this, is the reporting on Russian interference. So I'll let that story sit. We'll probably come back to it in questions and answers. So now, in light of the anniversary, the 19th anniversary of 9/11, and the prosecution of the counterterrorism campaign that took place globally with foreign partners. We could go on and on about that. In light of that anniversary, there are two op-eds that I want to call everyone's attention to that resonated with me. One was written by a 40+ year veteran who was the acting director of the National Counterterrorism Center. His name's Russ Travers. He published a excellent piece in Foreign Affairs that kind of outlined how we fought the war on terror for the past couple decades. And he reinforced that we have to build on the success of working with foreign partners. And at the same time, he reiterated the idea that we cannot squander our success. And he also acknowledged that we are dealing with other issues that are bigger than counterterrorism. There's an acknowledgement from counterterrorisms across the board, counterterrorism specialists, I should add. And I think Travers did a great job of outlining some of those concerns and reinforcing the point that we should not squander the work that's been done in the past couple decades. And similarly, another piece was published by actually my successor who worked in the White House after I did, Mr. Chris Miller, the Honorable Chris Miller. He has been confirmed and is now leading the National Counterterrorism Center. What Chris talked about in a very short op-ed was the fact that we can now begin to see the contours of success against Al-Qaeda, but we can't precipitously declare victory, to be sure. And we have to continue putting counterterrorism pressure. And when I say we, I'm talking continuing to work with our foreign partners that have been putting pressure on Al-Qaeda for 2 decades, realizing that Al-Qaeda is not just operating from Pakistan, it's not just operating from Afghanistan, they're operating in West Africa, in the Sahel, for example, in Africa. So I think those are 2 important pieces to reflect on. Also, I want to reinforce an interesting story, and it's a bit of a book recommendation. A former FBI agent by the name of Ali Safan. Ali Safan was an FBI agent that wrote a book called Black Banners about 9 years ago, and he talked about his experience fighting and investigating Al-Qaeda as an FBI agent, to include his experience interviewing high-value detainees. Much of that book, and some important sections of that book, were redacted by CIA. And recently, a back and forth between publishers and the CIA censors, that book has been reissued this month, ironically enough, with all of the redactions, for all intents and purposes, released to the public. So what was classified is now unclassified, and I urge people that are interested in non-coercive interrogations versus more coercive techniques. It's an important book. It's another book that really, reflecting on some of the lessons of 9/11, are important to reconsider in terms of time. And again, Ali Safan did a great job, I think, of telling his story. The next story, it takes us to Iran and Canada, of all places. There is an interesting individual who is a Canadian-Iranian software star, if you will, who works for Facebook. So he's of Iranian extraction. He's a Canadian citizen or living in Canada, and he goes home to native Iran. And while he is there, he is picked up by the Iranian guards, and he's essentially in custody for 7 days. A lot of psychological pressure was placed on this Canadian, and through that pressure, they insisted that he becomes a spy, in essence, for the guards, and he goes back to Canada and builds relationships with people in the United States and serves Iranian national interests. He was under a great deal of pressure. He agreed to do it, went back to the West, and then said, "I'm not doing this." He told his story. What this underscores is not only the idea of coercion in Iran, it just underscores that there is a culture, not the Iranian people, I want to make the distinction, but the Iranian government continues a culture of hostage taking. And this is just another story. As I said, a Canadian story, a story of a businessman, a story of Iran. And that's a great segue into a documentary I want to highlight for our listeners that's poignant. It's raw, it's tough to watch, but it's really important. 40 years after the US hostage taking in the seizure of the US embassy, a documentary by a woman by the name of Barbara Koppel, who has done some excellent documentary work, was just released. The documentary, I found it through, I think, Hulu or someone, and I watched the documentary. It is an important story. It's an international story as well as an American story. But again, it just underscores the way the Iranian government has behaved for 40 plus years. I think it's worth watching it, and you make your own determination. And the final story that I'll flag for everyone is fascinating. Anyone that's been to the International Spy Museum appreciates that we've told part of the story on Edward Snowden. There has been some media writing of late suggesting that he could be pardoned, and the president, when asked a question by a media personality, he said he would take a look at it, he would consider it. Certainly, he's made no commitment to a pardon, and I would just underscore that the story I'm focusing on is some Washington Examiner reporting from the Attorney General himself, who said he is vehemently opposed to any such pardon of Snowden, who he considers, in quotes, a traitor. So I would say watch that story, how it plays out in the future. And lastly, I want to highlight a book that I'm reading, which I think is very important, and I think our audience should consider it. It's called Behind the Iraq War, A Story of Influence, Intelligence, and presidential power. I will also flag there's a complimentary review that's well done by, full disclosure, a friend of mine by the name of Josh Geltzer. He did an excellent job of reviewing the book. You can take a look at the review in the Washington Post. But Josh's point of view is it's a timeless story of politicization, why we went off to war in 2003. It's a story of not just politicization, but analysis, strong personalities in national security decision making. And we tackle some of this broadly at the International Spy Museum. So those are the stories that I'm tracking. Those are my book recommendations. I can't wait to hear from Mary Beth to fill in some of the gaps and talk about things that she's concerned with right now.
Well, I was listening very carefully to what Chris had to say, and I'll just comment on a couple of things. Just to be clear, my comments are my own and are not necessarily those of the Spy Museum. Chris is right. There's a lot going on. I think the tragedy of the news articles about Director Brennan and even the conversation with Dan Coates, the former director of the DNI, is the real struggle that the intelligence community and the intelligence apparatus that are part of the FBI and our related institutions are having, really with two things. And that's the at least appearance or the feeling by many that there has been a politicization of our intelligence organizations and perhaps an abuse of traditional intelligence tools, whether or not you agree with the use and agree with any of the assertions of the use of them in the transition process. The mere question really gets to the real problem, which is in all of this, the Russians got what they wanted and more. I think there's at least some very good reporting that the Russians were sort of hoping to deflect and to disrupt our politics and our elections. They always do. It's a standard modus operandi that I learned at CIA. Got to interrupt those elections, but they got way more than that. They not only interrupted the elections, but they, in many respects, underlined the confidence of the American people in the electoral process and called into question the institutions themselves and some of our most important institutions, the venerated FBI, and of course our intelligence apparatus. So for me, that's the real concern and the real story here. On Alexei, again, standard operating procedures, the Russians have killed and targeted their dissidents historically, as do the Iranians. Many of you are aware of a parallel process in which the Iranians killed one of their most famous, Navid Afkari, a very famous wrestler. They executed him after having his participation, in some of the demonstrations be questioned by Iranian authorities. The interesting news item to watch is that the Iranian foreign minister will be coming to town as part of the UNGA, the United Nations national and international meeting, the General Assembly in New York. The minister himself, who I've met several times and meet sometimes occasionally these days in discussions, will be a invited guest of the Council of Foreign Relations. He is an interesting guy. He will say everything that he's generally predicted to say, which is all is good in Iran. But there is a bit of controversy about him being invited to speak by the CFR and other organizations. Big doings in Washington this week, with everyone running around, are the really historic and unprecedented recognition by the Kingdom of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates of Israel, being touted as first steps toward peace. I think that's accurate. It's not peace. Peace is not broken out. The Palestinian issue remains. However, what this really does is, in addition to having two very important Gulf players go way out in front and recognize not only the existence of Israel, but the right of Israel to exist as a state and tacitly accept the two-state solution. The preamble of the accord itself talks about the importance of the role of Jordan, but the annex goes into really extensive, probably between 10 and 12 areas of cooperation, commercial, space, economic, all kinds of areas of cooperation. And what this does is it's not just an economic or a tacit tactical agreement among these players. It is the first Arab country to break away from what has generally and historically been an assumption on the part of the Palestinians that the Arab card was theirs to play as far as gaining and negotiating the peace process in the Middle East. So this is probably the first of several accords or agreements or moves on the part of a number of Gulf states. People, of course, are talking about follow up by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Qataris have been working with the Israelis in important ways in Gaza for quite some time now. So the other shoes will drop in the next couple of weeks. The focus will be on what was offered in exchange, not only between and among the parties, but what role the U.S. has played and what we will be giving, basically, or facilitating to the Israelis, to the Bahrainis, and to the Emiratis in order to facilitate this accord. A lot of focus will be on weaponry. The F-35s, a very important multi-role jet that Lockheed Martin has been instrumental in. It's a NATO tool. It's probably our best, that with the F-22 capabilities in the air, and what that will do to the arms race, some would describe it, in the Middle East, and how that will also play out economically for U.S. defense industries. Not only is it the anniversary of 9/11, I just want to remind folks it's also the anniversary of the Benghazi incident, which was also in 9/11. I was in eastern Libya about a year ago this last March. Lots of developments and what's going on there, that the Eastern government just resigned. That has become very much of a proxy war with a lot of the Gulf states and Europeans who are on the ground and facilitating one side or the other. The national government in Tripoli having won the upper hand in the last couple months with the help of Turkey. It's a little bit of an anecdotal war or conflict that is developing in the Mediterranean that has huge implications for NATO and for the US, where you have Turkey that's sort of on the US side, or at least on the Libyan national government side in Libya, but is opposed to the French in what is developing as a very hot debate between and among the Greeks, the Cypriots, the Turks, and the Mediterranean players on who will control gas and other reserves in the Mediterranean, with the US and the Russians standing by. Probably will devolve into what many of these conflicts are devolving into, which is proxy wars and elements of great power competition, which is also being played out, of course, in the Middle East between and among the Gulf countries, the US and China, with Russia taking a backseat lately, except in Syria. I've been meeting with all of these countries pretty much in the last 6 months. Lots going on. A lot of this is going to have a huge impact on trade and other relationships. Couple other just comments. Big debates in the intel community about the role of China and the role of artificial intelligence moving forward, as we look at increasing fear that China and somewhat a lesser extent Russia have penetrated or infiltrated some of our core capabilities in communications. There's also a big debate that's brewing about not only the potential abuse of intel weapons and intel tools, as was initially the focus of the Snowden disclosures, but also the migration of what used to be traditional intelligence Title 50 tools that were reserved for our CIA primarily, and the tools that are generally Title 10 tools, military tools, and how those have become interchangeable and leveraged somewhat concerningly, and somewhat, some would argue, impermissibly in operations domestically and against U.S. persons abroad. The other issues that are coming up, of course, are great power competition playing out elsewhere in Latin America with Venezuela, and a lot of incursions by the Iranians in some of countries that were traditionally our backyard. And of course, everyone talking about the role of domestic security and intelligence agencies and what may be the fallout or domestic strife that are related to our elections, and what role, if any, foreign players have in some of our domestic protests and groups, and how we are dealing with that as a nation and coming together on the appropriateness, for example, of interventions by our institutions in some of the Black Lives Matters or some of the other organizations that are involved in protests, and the co-opting or leveraging of those by other organizations, including foreign ones, in participation of violence and rioting. And I'll leave it at that. Lots of issues, and happy to be here. I want to thank our sponsors and open myself for any questions.
Hello, and lots of questions. Thank you all for sharing what you are thinking about and focusing on and maybe even worrying about. One question regarding pressuring people to spy. Did either or both of you read the New Yorker article on Siras Asghari? Do you have any thoughts on that? Does that mean
Go ahead.
anything?
No, I was going to defer because I think I only saw it briefly, so someone would have to refresh my memory. Any thoughts on
I
that?
scanned the article, and I got to be honest with you. I have not found myself particularly engaged in a lot of what the New Yorker has written lately. So I scanned the article. I disregarded, thought, took some points away. It's not a particularly unique coercion, if that's what you want to call it, or recruitment. I mean, let's be honest. I spent 13 years undercover at CIA. Recruiting is what you do. It's the humans, or which is human intelligence, and organizing oneself and convincing people to share secrets with you from other nations, information that you wouldn't otherwise have, is an age-old tradition. Some would argue, with some competition from other professional areas, one of the oldest professions, and not surprising in any way. But I have difficulty with some of the there's a lot of intelligence or so-called intelligence writing that is unsourced or poorly sourced. So I'm sure it's a great article. I did not have the time to give it, I'm sure, the attention that it was due.
Amanda, if I could just jump in there. So I appreciate the question. So that is a point of departure for me to go back and read the article. So I apologize, I don't have the fidelity on it. But let me offer this, though, having not read the article. I would just say that I already mentioned the case of the recruitment of our special forces, the United States Special Forces officer. Everything about the indictment, everything that I could garner from what I could read, that is a classic case of the Russians doing their homework in ideological recruitment, providing a uniform, somebody that didn't appear to be, at least on the surface, greedy, but ideologically aligned. Somebody did their homework. Somebody also did a great deal of preparation and convinced him to do things that he was otherwise not going to do. Like what? Instead of staying as an infantry officer, the Russians encouraged him to develop more placement and access and become a special forces officer. That would clearly be of greater value to the Russians. So what appealed to me about the article, though I find it repugnant from a standpoint of being an American, all of that said, the Russians did a very good job up to the point of the operation was compromised and this guy was rolled up, which is good for the United States and clearly not good for Russia.
But that's, as Chris, that's one of the classics. So when you recruit an asset who's going to spy for you, you not only take advantage of his or her immediate access, but some of the appeal of working as a spy is you get the recognition that you may not be getting in your own system. You get reinforcement of your skills and your value, and you're encouraged to expand your horizons into areas that are of intelligence interest to the United States by increasing your influence, by increasing your portfolio, by rising up in your organization. So again, classic attempt, classic approach, and one that we take great advantage of, and of course is used against us as well, which is why counterintelligence, not only for those who are in government, but for those of you who are listening in industry and in important areas, being aware that you're always vulnerable to somebody looking over your shoulder and thinking, that person may know something that I want to know. It's something that we all need to think about. And it's one of the reasons why I personally feel that we're in a bad place as a nation, and that it used to be bipartisan and sort of, an objective, unified approach of the US in supporting our intelligence and our foreign policy objectives. And we've fallen a bit away from that, and it's been a bit politicized. I know that's part of what's going on, but and we need to make sure that we're all very much aware of our roles as citizens in protecting our secrets and keeping an eye on what's going on around us.
I know we're more global than ever. And if we didn't know that, the pandemic has certainly made us realize there are no borders. So since we're talking about Russians a little bit, of course, we're going to talk about Russia some more. Question about your favorite, Chris, with Russia's involvement in the last election. Do you think it's possible to regain trust and become allies with the country?
So that's an excellent question. I appreciate it. I think from a historical standpoint, there was hope in the early 1990s, and I was a young counterintelligence officer. And at the same time that we were trying to have partnerships for peace, I think we're one of the programs that was instituted in NATO. Our former Soviet adversaries continue to spy on us. That said, there was some possibility for for broader cooperation, certainly in the counterterrorism space. But time and time again, the Russians have fallen back on their history and their playbook. And that's why I continue to underscore everything Putin is doing is based in a lot of ways, I would say, revenge with a little r, where he is trying to reverse some of the goodness that happened out of the wall falling down in 1989. So that's my perspective. They are our adversaries right now in many ways. I hope, though, that there's a future someday without Putin, where there's the possibility, again, that some future leader warms up to the United States and we're truly able to become partnerships and work on some of the global problems that might come up or already have come up, like pandemics. So I'm sure Mary Beth has some great thoughts on this.
I'm laughing only because hope springs eternal. But I grew up at CIA with a China background and other areas, and during the years of Gorbachev, which I was a young case officer, still targeting Russians abroad, there was some hope of sharing, and we've always had a certain level of cooperation, particularly in the space arena and in other arenas. But the bottom line is, Russia never stopped spying on us, and we never stopped spying on them. And with the assumption of power of KGB officer Putin, who approaches most of his, not only his foreign, but his domestic policies and his roles from a traditional line officer, human intelligence officer. That's the way he operates. It's not going to change while he's in power. And while that man is alive, I think it'd be very difficult for him not to be in power, given the way that he has arranged Russia. Russia is still trying to focus on its near far, which is the old Soviet Union, and as we speak, putting a tremendous pressure on Belarus. And I expect to see Russian involvement there in coercing the Belarusians who are out on the street protesting their leadership's overtures toward Putin as we're speaking. While we don't talk about the Ukraine anymore, the Ukraine is still very much in danger, as are the what we traditionally call the frozen conflicts, Abkhazia and the Crimea, frankly, skipping over to Crimea. So, look, Russia's not an ally. I don't think it's going to be an ally in our lifetimes. Can we have some limited cooperation with them? Perhaps, but not with this leadership, and certainly only with our eyes wide open.
We have several questions, people wondering about whether you think there's outside influence involved with the unrest in our country right now.
Which one of us are you asking, Amanda?
Oh, it's always open to either.
I'll jump in.
Sorry.
You know, I want to be very careful answering this because I don't want to offend anyone. So I'm going to make a broader statement first. Our foreign adversaries, whether it is Russia or China or even Iran, from a national perspective, but there are non-state actors, have always looked to take advantage of American pressure points, whether it's race, whether it's inequalities of any way, whether it is our migration or immigration and refugee policies, to exploit our differences and to amplify them. And it would be very naive for any of us to believe that there are not concerted efforts, particularly using social media and organizations to amplify the discord that we have and to exacerbate it and to attempt to manipulate it. So in my mind, there is no doubt that there are, particularly in social media and on the ground organizations, to take advantage of our real divisive politics right now. Our ability to allow that to have an impact is our responsibility, and shame on us, frankly, if we can't see it and get past it. I think we all need to be wary that to the extent that there are violations of each other's rights, violations of property sanctity, violations of our, frankly, killings and destruction of property, we need to stop and think about what it is we're trying to accomplish and whether whoever is behind that and whether it's legitimate in anyone's eyes, what that does as far as opening up ourselves to two things. And one is a lack of confidence in our own electoral process and in our own institutions. And secondly, how vulnerable that makes us as a country and as individuals and as communities to outside influences who want nothing more than for us to destroy ourselves internally. And I'll leave it at that.
So Mary Beth did a great job of answering that question. So I'll be brief and just reinforce that. And we've talked about this, a constant theme is there's a polarization here in the United States, and not just in the United States. So that's a vulnerability that Mary Beth got to and the point that she made. At the same time, there has been reporting, credible reporting in the press that the Russians in particular are taking advantage of racial discord and fake social media posts, etc. So yes, our adversaries classically, again, this goes back to the Soviet model, which has now been adapted by the successors, the Russian FSB. And Amanda is going to smile when I say this. I had an opportunity recently to talk to an FSB defector that underscored that that is exactly what the Russians will continue to do, to take advantage of that discord and to undermine our confidence in institution, but also get us to fight each other. Maybe not literally, but figuratively fight each other as a nation. That discord is so important as a principle of disinformation.
We'll be doing a program with that defector in November. So that's just a little inserted advertisement. Sorry, it's going to be very interesting. All right, this is for both of you. Mary Beth is going to want to jump on it. How do you think the new Middle East peace agreements will impact both intelligence operations and U.S. military in that region? But I know you both want.
I'm very excited about it. And the fact of the matter is, and people really don't want to talk about it, is that many of the traditional Arab countries have long been cooperating with the Israelis on various levels. I spend a lot of time with the Israelis even now, but certainly when I was in office, and from an intelligence perspective, any Israeli officer will tell you now or 10 years ago that the first line of defense for Israel is the Jordanian services. The second line of defense was making sure that the Egyptians and the Israelis work well. And that's not going to change. And in fact, that's going to be amplified and broadened with the nascent cooperation, with mutual areas of interest, Al Qaeda, ISIS. And I will put a little note down. I actually think that Al Qaeda is rising a little bit. And I was going to call Chris on it a little while ago, but I'll let that one slide for now. But I think in areas of mutual interest, you're going to see what has been strong under the surface cooperation may be amplified just a bit, but mostly tucked up underneath cultural, trade, and other political activities. From a military perspective, the big question is, does any of this allow Israel to breathe easier? And the fact of the matter is, not really, because it's been at least 10 years before, I would say, or since Israel has felt a major military threat from most of the Arab countries. Yes, QME, the qualitative military edge, what that really is the gap between Israel's military capability and its its Arab or Middle Eastern or adversaries or our allies' capabilities, so that always Israel had an edge. That's codified in our laws. Israel will always protect it. And frankly, the Middle East is quite aware that is an obligation that the U.S. has accepted, that we will always advocate for. Now, what will happen, though, is, and as a practical matter, people really don't want to talk about it, is part and parcel to this agreement and part and parcel to our long obligations with the Israelis and others is going to be, there's going to be a lot of weapons sales. And there's going to be a lot of weapons transfers as a result of this. And there'll be a lot of things in play, not only among particularly the UAE and the Israelis, but every other country is standing by going, if the Emiratis get this, how can we say no to the Omanis, the Bahrainis, the Saudis, the Qataris? And what does this do to an escalation, some people would say a Cold War competition of who has the most and what capabilities in the Middle East, and how does that serve our interests? It does, to the extent that our Arab and other allies can take on our threats in the Middle East and other areas. Iran help us balance what's going on with our great power conflict with China and Russia in the Middle East, how they can participate in counterterrorism, and how we can look at the real unstable countries that are really a threat to our national security by sending weapons and capabilities to them so that we don't have to do it. Guys like Chris don't have to go downrange. That's important, but that's how it's all going to play out. And it's going to be very confusing and very complicated in the next couple of weeks. And there'll be, I think, a lot of the discussion between our executive and our Congress and our intelligence and militaries about how this is going to be implemented. So stay tuned.
Well, Mary Beth is so fresh on these issues. I'll take you back to the first year of the administration to kind of address the question and just to offer this. First of all, I agree with everything Mary Beth just said. I was very optimistic when I left the White House in 2018 on what had happened, what I saw beginning to take place in the Middle East, having gone on one trip to Israel to include meeting with President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, to include going to talk to our foreign partners in Jordan, expressing my concerns, as always, with Al Qaeda and ISIS or some other generation of future terrorists, but at the same time, very much worried about future partnerships. And I got the sense that the administration was lining things up for a bloc to counter Iranian malign behavior. The setback, we've talked about this before. I was disappointed to see what happened for a lot of reasons with the murder of Khashoggi. That really set us back, right? Up to
You
that
noticed
point.
today, hang on, I'm interrupting. Did you notice today the announcement that those who were prosecuted are having their sentences commuted?
I didn't see that. That's interesting. So I'll watch that very closely. So disappointing, but at the same time, to your point, Mary Beth, what I see happening now is this realignment and sort of a block to counter Iran, and where we get away from a anti-Israel bloc in the Middle East. I think this is very, very positive. We'll see how the Palestinians change some of their perspectives. I just hope there's some middle ground. So I'm more optimistic than less. And just a comment, again, to preempt, I want you to call me out, but I did not fully agree with some of the assessment of my counterparts that are still in the administration on Al-Qaeda. In fact, my point is I believe that there's a possibility core Al-Qaeda, in particular in Afghanistan, is going to get some new energy as a result of Taliban that aren't interested at all in working with the Afghanistan government. So to be clear, I want peace to break out in Afghanistan, but I am concerned this is going to breathe new life into core Al-Qaeda. And certainly I did allude to the fact that I am worried about Africa, and frankly, I was worried about Africa when I was in the position at the White House. So it is, I hate the term whack-a-mole and sort of the analogies that we use, but the bottom line is this is not going to end. There's not going to be a singular victory, and I have some significant concerns. The good news is I think that the global partnerships between not just the United States, and not just with the Five Eyes, not just with our traditional partners, but our non-traditional partners, and the partnerships with the Jordanians, as Mary Beth alluded to, the partnerships with the Iraqis, as we pull back troops from Iraq. We're going to have to rely on those partners. I think this is a good trend.
I think, and I'm going to interrupt for a second. Chris, as always, is right. One of the trends that I think folk are seeing in Yemen and in Africa and other places are because of the overreach with ISIS, where they just became so militant and so focused on the physical caliphate that Al-Qaeda, particularly in Africa and other places, sort of retrenched and focused more on their local authorities and local co-option. And there may be sort of a resurgence of Al-Qaeda as a formidable foe, particularly, as Chris mentioned, in Afghanistan and other places where they've set back and sort of reconstructed, re-strengthened, reconstituted themselves. Sorry, Amanda.
No, this is all great. And this may, I don't know if you'll want to elaborate more, but while we're on Afghanistan, touched on Afghanistan, someone wanted to know in particular about the stability and development of local Afghan and Iraqi forces and their ability to maintain peace and safety. Any comment on, how they might do?
I've spent a lot of time, not the way Chris has, but in both, and I still have a business in Afghanistan. Frankly, I'm not optimistic. Afghanistan, while we are doing our best to help the government, the Afghan National Police and Afghan National Army are still struggling. While the Taliban, to the extent it exists as a unified organization, is negotiating with us for this so-called peace, other elements or the Taliban itself out the back door is involved in an unprecedented, in the last year, war of violence that results still in U.S. allies and Afghan deaths. I think, but this is not to say that I think we're headed down the wrong path. Afghanistan has been at war with itself for literally decades in civil conflict. And I think that that's going to play itself out, frankly. Unfortunately, I think it'll play itself out through the auspices of organizations like Al Qaeda, possibly ISIS. There's a lot of Iranian influence that's been going on and has been going on in Afghanistan that we don't tend to talk about. My firm belief is that current situation, I'm not sure there's much that can be done that hasn't been done already from the outside, and that it's headed for troubled waters. I feel differently on Iraq. Iraq is in an interim government with elections coming up. The current prime minister is a former intelligence officer. And while I was skeptical, and those who follow me on Twitter will know I was skeptical, I could not be more enthusiastic about Prime Minister Kadhimi and what he has done. I pronounce his name wrong every time. My apologies to the Prime Minister and the Iraqis. Talk about a guy who's done some really bold reform. He has taken on the militia in the ways that only Iraqis will understand. On the one hand, very tough. On the other hand, a little bit conciliatory in order not to rock the boat and destabilize and undermine all the other reformist efforts that he's undertaken. He's got a great group around him. He has been supportive in the way that I think has been positive with the demonstrations and the Iraqi youth who are looking for peace. I think for the first time, I personally am optimistic that there's a path forward on Iraq. I think that they will need a lot of our and other support going forward. But I don't know, Chris, how do you feel?
So I agree with your assessment completely.
Not to argue about something, Chris.
I know. Uh, it's good news, right? Because your point on the Iraqis, they've learned once what happens. They had the training, they had the equipment. In 2014, they melted away in Mosul. It was extremely disappointing, but the Iraqis now and the people want to be a sovereign nation. They do not want to be tethered to the United States, nor do they want to, and a lot of people are wrong about this in their assessment that the Iraqi government is tethered to the Iranians somehow. And frankly, they want to be a sovereign nation. When I think of Iraq, I think of the people that I trained to conduct reconnaissance and surveillance, to take inordinate risks for me as an American, to collect intelligence and to answer requirements that serve their nation and protected US lives. That said, I am more optimistic with Iraq than I am Afghanistan. And that's not to say, on the point of Afghanistan, that I don't have tremendous respect for the Afghan people. And again, the people that pop into my mind's eye as I speak are the sources that saved American lives. The people that saved American lives that I dealt with, either in a car pickup or in a safe house or just an intelligence walk-in. Sometimes I was misled, other times lives were saved. All of that said, I am still concerned with the dynamic of corruption, the dynamic of former Taliban that are unsatisfied with anything that looks like a more democratic Afghanistan. All of that said, the United States can't sort all of that out. If we've learned nothing else, we don't do nation building. We've learned that. After 2 decades, we should have learned that lesson. So I think a small footprint of US forces putting pressure on terrorist organizations when the future Afghan government asks for help, I think there is some optimism there, but I also can't help thinking back on my understanding of what played out in the late 1980s, and also, the back and forth between warlords vying for power. So more to follow. People are going to argue that, again, people like me just continue to say that we need a footprint to do counterterrorism work. All of that said, we don't need large footprints. We don't have to fight endless wars. We have to work with our foreign partners to the extent that we can with intelligence partnerships. We have to make sure that We work with the global community for donors to support countries like Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, we're not going to solve all of Afghanistan's problems.
Well, I have to tell you all, I have so many cool questions, but there's really only time for one more. So I want to apologize to everyone who put in amazing questions, and we'll share them with Mary Beth and Chris, and maybe you'll hear from them, or maybe you'll hear from us. But this is so timely. What are your thoughts about the aftermath of the recent Beirut explosion? Does that have impact on, the intelligence community or hearts and minds? What are your thoughts?
Wow, there's so many different levels of approaching that question. Number one, I just for those who are charitably minded, there I believe is an upcoming event, and I can't remember exactly what it is, where individuals are. I think it's an international musical or other event where individuals are looking for those who will donate not only money but clothing and other for those who were victims of the explosion in Beirut. And I encourage people to participate. My first job in life was working for an Arab bank, speaking fluent Spanish and Chinese. Of course, that made sense. And I did some time in Beirut. What an amazing city, and what the Lebanese people are fantastic. And spent some time with the Minister of Defense. Lebanon hopefully will use this as an opportunity to get its politics sorted. It has always been divided and divisive among its particular players. The people of Lebanon deserve better. The role of Hezbollah and Nasrallah have to be curtailed. For those who don't understand or believe that the Hezbollah organization was either directly or indirectly involved in that explosion, I would ask you to wake up. There's some very interesting and nascent, incredible information about there being tunnels underneath the port that people don't want to talk about that exacerbated the explosion. How you would allow that amount of nitrate to coexist at an international port. The Israelis will have a lot of information to tell you about how and why that happened. Hopefully, this will give the opportunity for the Lebanese people to demand better, and for there to be a concerted effort on the part of the politicians in Lebanon to do one thing, and that is to work for the Lebanese people. They are a tremendously diverse, business, cultural, religious, artistic, loving population, and I hope that the U.S. can support them. And for those of you who are policymakers or businessmen, I would encourage you to get involved in Lebanon, because it's a delight all the way around.
So I'm going to disappoint Mary Beth again, because I completely agree with her, especially the idea that the Lebanese people are tremendous people. Having gone to Beirut when I was serving in the government multiple times, I love the Lebanese people. The food is tremendous. Their culture is extraordinary. Initially, when the explosion happened, my gut would have told me that it was some kind of cache, that Hezbollah operators had weapons and explosives stored improperly, et cetera, et cetera. All of that said, I am not tracking all of the reporting in the back and forth, but I will say this, I think it gets to the heart of just bad governance. Hezbollah is a part of the government, whether we like it here in the United States or not. Hezbollah is a part of the government, and all of that said, the government really owes its people security and safety first and foremost. So that's a problem. In a backdrop for all of this, and a story I didn't talk about today, and I'll be super brief because I know we're running out of time, was the fact that there was an assassination unit of Hezbollah. It had a numerical designation, and the actual operator that killed Hariri in the early 2000s, the prime minister, was just identified. So it underscores again, what's that?
Only took 20 years, 30 years. How many?
Right.
What was it?
Right. But it just underscores this tension between Hezbollah, the government of Lebanon, and its inextricable links to Nasrallah, who leads Hezbollah. So it's an interesting dynamic. That's not going to be solved overnight, but I hope this is a wake-up call for the Lebanese government to take care of their people.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for such incredibly detailed and thoughtful, and really, you've been to these places, you know the people and your thoughts, and we really appreciate it. And let me tell you, the audience makes it clear that they appreciate it too. So we want to thank you both so much. We want to thank our sponsors today, Mission Solutions Group, really extraordinary how much they have supported our mission. And I want to invite our listeners, our watchers, that right now, any donation you make to the Spy Museum will be doubled by an anonymous donor through the end of the year. And that would be up to $1 million. And we'd love to get that.
Amanda, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Hey guys, this is an amazing museum. Not only is it a really cool place to come see all aspects of intelligence, but they have a mission to help educate our children about the role of intelligence and the role of government and the role of all the important things that we do. Write a check. It's also a really fun place for adults. So please make a donation.
Thank you, Mary Beth.
You're welcome.
She did that all on her own as one of our awesome board members. And I want to invite you, we do lots of programs for kids, for adults like this one. Tomorrow at noon, we'll be looking at one of our largest artifacts, the Berlin Tunnel. We have a lot of really cool and diverse programming coming up, but I got to tell you, we have a really interesting panel on October 26th. Mary Beth was on this panel last year. We change it up every year, Mother, Daughter, Sister, Spy. And it's incredible women from the intelligence field. So please check that out and everything else. And thank you for attending. And you can visit the Spy Museum because we're open. So, goodbye, everyone. Stay well. Take care.